we've reached the final program point of this day, and we'll have about 40 minutes for this panel discussion, and then about 20 more minutes for audience questions and discussion. So I just mentioned this beforehand. Of course, all our speakers here will be available for questions, but also all of the speakers of today are still sticking around. So if you have any questions relating to parts of this day, or like connecting different pieces that you've heard over the day, you may also ask those in the final Q&A after our panel discussion. And then I'll be brief. I just mention everyone's names again that of the speakers we have up here. You've just already heard of Sabit Buchmann, so I think there's no need for any further introduction. Helena Vilalta has already given a talk this morning and has worked on Pindell and Lozano. We've heard about Lozano, and we'll bring Pindell back into the conversation. Then we have Bärbel Vischer, who is a curator of contemporary art and head of contemporary art collections at MAG, and whom Werner Pichler has already mentioned, has done a big Rosemarie Castoro show at MAG in 2023 called Rosemarie Castoro Land of Lashes. So she'll be able to talk to us from the curatorial perspective about Castoro's work. And then we have Manuela Ammer, of whom you've already heard today, and who also, I think, needs no further introduction, but maybe I'll just briefly mention for all of those who were not around in the morning that Manuela has, of course, also worked on Lozano and has like had a project that was already also discontinued on Lozano's work. And has, of course, also worked on.
I dropped out.
Yeah, she has dropped out of a dissertation on Lozano. So the focus of our conversation will be what happened after the 60s and the 70s, basically how the careers of the artists we discussed today developed, how the work and reception went on from the 80s on, and I'll just mention two quick points that we saw in the program today. Like, it was very clear from the video Free, White and 21 that in Howardena Pindell's career, 1980 was a turning point. It was apparently marked by her reception as such in very clear ways, but also was visibly marked by her turn to video from abstract painting, which is like a turn at one point at the same time makes her body visible to the audience, but also puts it like in a distance, mediates it through new media in a different way than her painting practice had done, that still had like traces of her actual hands work in them. So that maybe one point of shift from 70s to 80s that was instructive that we talked about. And then I just found very interesting the poem Werner Pichler referred to of Rosemarie Castoro, "Time is the span between the appointment and the meeting." And I thought that one motto of our conversation could be that time or career or life is the space between the art production and the institutional solo show. So this time, of course, was of different lengths for the artists we talked about, and that might be one of the starting points for our conversation. Now, in terms of the shifts in the careers and in the works of the artists we talked about, I thought maybe, Bärbel, you want to start by talking about the exhibition you did and how you were presenting Castoro's work, and if you had the sense that there was a shift in the 80s, and if there was one, how did you present it and how did you relate to that?
I think there was a very strong shift in her work from the medium that she used. while that dance performance was throughout. Even in her early paintings, which we unfortunately haven't seen any images today, but they're polychromic paintings, abstract paintings with patterns that resemble the patterns of dance steps. I think this is important, and then she, in the late 60s, she shifted from using colors to non-colors. And in the exhibition, actually this, in a way, was the starting point with a small sculpture called Non-Correspondence Ladder, which was a small paravent, a panel system, which she later translated into the big dimensional wall panoramic works, where we saw today called sake. So I was interested that she really, conceptually made this shift, and also translated her body strong, much stronger than in the abstract works into the making. And I also found it very interesting that the techniques that she used and the concepts which are the base of her works really translated these movements. And we have seen a few images today, her photographic images, and they really document very well the process she was interested in. And one big frame for the exhibition was her studio. Talking about solo exhibitions, I think her solo exhibitions, the most important ones during her lifetime, maybe were in her own studio space. And the dimensions of the works are all related to this space. The works she created, they're very much, pick up on the measurement of the body. You see that in the brush stroke works very strongly, and also an image we saw today where she is on a swing in front of a work which resemble, the strokes of the pencils. So she translates this movement immediately into the drawings and paintings. And in the exhibition, like the title was, A Land of Flashes. And A Land of Flashes is an iconic work which has also a pendant, Land of Lads. And through these works, I also, the reading I put into this work is that it's about fluid gender identity. So, it means that Land of Lads, it's actually, do we have an image here? Because it's actually the two works that the Ludwig Stiftung bought for the collection. And lads at the same time means men, So she plays with this identity, and she wrote about this work, and I quote now. The ladder is a cultural tool, the forest a source of nourishment. I, a cultural animal, make tools to build forests. So she points out to this active role, and these ladders, you see it in the back, yeah, and they're actually not stable, and at the same time, they're abstract paintings because the surface is in acrylic, is from painting, and the way yeah. So actually, these lads, the young men are not on solid ground. They're could be shaking. And a year later, she made the sculpture Land of Lashes, which is like a brigade of lashes that also could resemble spiders or spider animals. And this is could be more connected to the female identity, but also to the lashes as a fetish. And so I think she really plays with gender roles and with the fluidity, and I think this is an important point in this work, and that she also, there's not just one meaning in one sculpture, but she adds up different meanings in one work. And what's also important is these works that she made, they're really, when they are being presented, they have to be on the ground, without a plinth. This was a challenge when I made the exhibition, because for conservatory reasons, you can't put them on the floor anymore. But this is an important element of all the, all of her works and post-minimal and minimal works. And also I found it interesting that she didn't stay just in her own community of discourse and artists, but that she also expanded, and referred, for instance, with the brushstroke works, it's also a reference to Roy Lichtenstein's brushworks, who translated the painting stroke into a sign. Or Land of Lashes also see some, a surrealistic turn, to name, for instance, Meret Oppenheim. And also, the contemporary, I think, because in the time, the exhibition started in the 60s. The latest work was from the 2000s, and it was called, the work was a steel sculptures arranged in a community of sculptures called Mountain Range. But Mountain Range, it also resembled, this, a sexual organ, as well as, the heart, or the application that you need, for your heart, like that's the insert, the stand, and it refers to an early phase of her works, when she made actually land art, called the branch dance. So there was many different layers, and I did include also her photographs that she took of herself, because it also resembled, it was the only way to make her accessible, because it was the first exhibition in a German-speaking area of Europe, and she was in the circle with Karl Andre and Donald Judd, but until the exhibition in 2017 in MAC in Barcelona, I think at least in Europe, since a long time she has not been part of the discussion.
Yeah, I mean, now the way you talked about it actually sounds like there's a lot of continuities in Castoro's work, from her posing on the floor to putting her sculpture on the floor, and kind of everything having this performative quality. But maybe we'll still pick up on the discontinuities in those practices, and also in the way the careers were shaped and received. And maybe all of you, whoever would like to respond to that, maybe all of you would like to talk about where those discontinuities and active refusals or practices of discontinuity lie in. I mean, in Lozano's work, it's kind of obvious. We could still talk about that, but also in Castoro's and Pindell's practices, like where are the active refusals, where are the breaks and discontinuities, and also where are the involuntary breaks in the way their careers took shape. I don't know.
Well, if we don't put Lozano to the front where it's rather obvious, I'm not the expert on Pindell and Castoro, but I suppose, I mean, Lozano's disengagement with the art market and institutional art world in New York, culminating in the Dropout piece, is, and I think we've heard a little bit about that today, is also not like a dramatic act at the end, but rather something that builds up over time. And other pieces that have been mentioned, general strike piece, boycott piece, and so on and so forth, would be examples in the instructional written form. But even with the wave paintings, as you've said, Helena, there is kind of a goodbye, an air of goodbye. They're surrounded by an air of goodbye and punching, you know, escape holes, literally, or escape routes into the canvas.
Yeah, no, yeah, definitely. I think there's kind of a sequence of goodbye. You know, there's always doesn't work, right? Oh. There you go. Yeah, I would say that in Lozano's work of the late 60s, there's a series of goodbyes that are kind of constantly anticipated and echo each other rather than kind of a stark drop-off point. But I guess in terms of thinking about withdrawal, I think with Lozano, you know, engaging with, you know, the problems and the potentials of her work at the same time is important, and also to think about kind of the problems that come with this prefigurative politics, right? Acting as if you were already in the world to come, but, you know, the society hasn't changed. So, and I think that cuts two ways. You know, we saw earlier on her statement for the Art Workers Coalition. That's kind of one of the ways in which we began the day. And there, you know, I think she's making a really important point that it's not just about, you know, changing structures, it's also about changing subjectivity. But then when you only change subjectivity without any of the structures around you changing, then that becomes much more problematic or harder to handle, I would say. So I think there's that tension. But another way to think about this is to think about, you know, Lozano's refusal in comparison with Pindell's. You know, Lozano's refusal, gestures of refusal are always, you know, quite dramatic, even though, by the way, I did listen to the sound recordings of the Art Workers Coalition, and her statement for that, that meeting is, you know, the most kind of calm and poised statement that I've ever heard, you know, which is in contrast with kind of the image that we have of Lozano as being very radical and kind of furious in the later work. But yeah, you could compare kind of her refusal to Pindell's, who takes a very different position, particularly in the decade of the 90s, which, you know, I would call her position more as a kind of a form of critical participation. So already in the early 70s, you know, she's talking about how she sees a potential for change in the refusal of women and Black artists to kind of refuse the conditions in which they are exhibiting their work. And she says, well, what the important thing for me is to remain involved and to make myself vulnerable. And I think that's kind of the principle that she applied to her engagement with AR Gallery, and heresies to begin with, but then in the 80s there's this turning point, where she's saying, well, actually with Free White and 21, she's also kind of making very visible her objections to the way in which, these spaces are handled. So I think, when we think about withdrawal, non-participation, refusal, it's kind of important to think about kind of the smaller gestures or the kind of longer term practices of refusal that take place, alongside these more kind of dramatic gestures.
I also think what's interesting about the dramatic gestures of Lozano is that they're in a different way not dramatic at all, because they're just like ongoing and, I don't know, not boring, but just very repetitive. Like somebody mentioned today, at that time we were building up the show and she was still not talking to women. So she was just making everything complicated. It's like not that dramatic, it's just a really long time commitment. I don't know, do you want to add something on
probably
Castoro's
some
work?
general remarks on the time around 1980s, because Bärbel was already pointing to the development of Rosemarie Castoro's work. For me, it is striking that there were various tendencies. On the one hand, we recall, of course, Craig Owen's really influential text on the allegorical impulse and towards a theory of the postmodern, that the postmodern condition became a kind of dominant mode of the reconceptualization of what had happened in the 60s and the 70s, what formerly had been called kind of serial, minimal art, then became reread as a kind of allegorical practice, yeah. And at the same time, we discover and we that there is a kind of return to the metaphorical, yeah. So that the underlying structures, the rhetorics of the works, very much changed, and we see, and you explained that very well, that Rosemarie Castoro more went back to sculpture in a kind of more ambivalent sense, yeah. And on the other hand, we saw Howardena Pindell's locating her work in a broader context of visual culture, and that was the same with Yvonne Rainer, who then had left the dance field and had already turned in 72 to film, and she was much more interested in exploring the methods of what we would call cultural studies and categories of cultural studies, yeah, in sense of gender, race, class, and intersectionality. And doing that in a different context. And we see, I think, also in a kind of feminist field, or not only feminist field, but female artists, that on the one hand, they turn to a kind of more material laden work, yeah, on the one hand, and on the other hand, to shift into a totally different field, yeah. That's, I think, for me, obvious. And at the same time, in the 1980s, a young generation of female gallerists and curators came up, yeah, and they took up this kind of postmodern, yeah, re-articulation on the condition of artistic production in bringing in all these kind of cultural studies-based, views on art as in terms of identity politics, subjectivities, and so on and so on. And that was happening throughout the 1980s, parallel to what someone of the speakers were calling this kind of conservative shift in the 80s, beginning in 1980 with Ronald Reagan, Thatcher, Helmut Kohl in Germany. So, and it went parallel to a kind of neoliberalization, yeah, of the art market and a new, kind of financial system. And so that was by Sophie Krah. Yeah, I think she mentioned this in a very precise way. So that's a complex decade, I would say. And someone like, just to end with this, Marcia Tucker founded a new Museum of Contemporary Art in order to bring in all these new tendencies. So it was not the end of something, but a heavy transformation of the field and a kind of diversification, I would say.
Yeah. Can I pick up on that? Because I think there's clearly a shift, but also I was wondering, one of the things that we've heard about today is how these artists were in the 70s already, were making work that was, based on their own experiences and kind of the experience of their own lived bodies, but also they were trying to engage with collective experience. So we've talked about how they were engaging in questions of pink-collar labor, how they were engaging with black cultural practice. So, you could also, I guess, see this kind of transition into the 80s as kind of a deepening of those processes, but then also responding to this kind of new historical backdrop and also the rollback of some of the political gains of the 1970s.
Yeah, thank you.
It was also the period of institutionalization of practices that were considered radical of the 60s and 70s, right? So was a lot of things that happened.
Necessary development,
Yes.
I would say. I'm thankful that the new Museum of Contemporary Art was founded and many other new institutions in order, otherwise we wouldn't know about these practices anymore.
I
was just thinking about what both Sabet and you, Barbara, said about the drama of the Lozano gesture on the one hand, and about I think Sabet, you used the term shift, but shift not a historical shift, but shift in the practices of some of these artists, and of course, Helena, I don't know if you would agree with me, but of course you could make a similar argument for Lozano, who dropped out of the New York art world, but continued, I think, to think about herself as an artist and continued to pursue some of these pieces, the boycott piece being the most prominent one. But I think there's traces that might be true for other pieces, the collecting cash piece and other and other things that she noted in her private notebooks, which have been published a few years ago, I think, and before were not available. She just was not interested in an audience anymore. And I think what is known about her time after the eviction is that she stayed in New York until the early 80s and was very present in a kind of a punk scene close to the Bowery, engaging more with a younger generation, which I find interesting, kind of leaving her peers and engaging with a younger generation. And then in the early 80s, she left for Dallas. And I don't know, it's a different kind of shift, but I don't think she necessarily gave up thinking about herself as an artist and thinking about how she lived her life as being, an art-based experience. I don't know what, or anybody.
I think she had qualms with the category of artist. So at some point she says, I'm first a thinker, a person, a creative person, rather than an artist itself, because I think the category of artist brings with it, all the kind of institutional structures that we associate with art. So near the end, she changes her name, she's kind of dropping identities rather than picking up new identities, I think. But she definitely is engaged in this creative practice, and I think the piece that also continues is dialogue piece, in the sense that she is interested in having these conversations that, you know, are very much for her kind of a creative practice of sharing ideas with others and making something to happen with others, you know. And so I think that kind of continues in some way or another, but we don't really have necessarily the traces to kind of, be able to reconstruct that history. And it's very much her choice to not give us those traces, those residues, you know. So again, we could kind of circle back to the morning and think about this notion of telepathy, or, you know, what happens when there's a kind of creative energy flowing through, but we don't have any residue of that exchange. And I think it goes back again to this porousness of, you know, in the relation between artist and listener, or viewer listener in case of the dialogue.
I think also with the relation of artist and listener, or who receives, who is it, who listens or who receives what is made, we could also transition to the question how the artists we talked about, how their work of the 60s and 70s, but also their work after relates to the contemporary moment and to the present, and how we would situate them in relation to contemporary art or contemporary curatorial practice, how to, how to work with the careers that kept on developing, like Pindell is still making work and being an active artist, as opposed to Lozano, who kind of dropped out but also kept on practicing, and Castoro, who was practicing until her death in, I think, 2015.
Right. Yes.
15. So how to keep those works in relation to contemporary themes, practices, and how, like, that might be a question first posed to the people working as curators. How do you show these works and keep them related to the contemporary moment?
No, when I discovered the work of Rosemarie Castoro, and also, you know, the MAC made two proposals in different years of two of her works, and in this process of, you know, even before, long before I curated the exhibition, I was in exchange also with a sculptor here in Vienna, Toni Schmale, and you know, and the MAC actually has a work by her called Vagina Dentata, and of course, you know, for me, the Vagina Dentata of Castoro, you know, also spoke to me in that context of Toni Schmale being a contemporary artist today, and I think, you know, what's so contemporary also about Castoro is that she is, you know, as Werner described it before, that you know, she stood for her own mind, and I think you can feel it. And also, you know, the works, when she produced them, she was a young artist, a very young artist, you know. So, so you can follow that, and that resonates also to contemporary artists today, and also the way she worked in her studio alone, you know, without assistance. This is, you know, very rare to find, and especially in her, you know, maybe, you know, the last material shift that she did to metal, when she made it alone, you know, you need this power, and you know, again, Toni Schmale is a reference here, and Toni Schmale actually, when she saw the work Mountain Range in the exhibition, of course, she was very, you know, fascinated, because she could recognize her own practice. And, to show Rosemarie Castoro in Vienna, was also for the artists, because I just imagined that for artists working today, it would be a contribution to give them.
You want to add something?
I think we should open to the audience.
Yes. Thank you for that.
Like
yes.
that suggestion.
So, does anyone have any questions to our panel or to the speakers of today? Or is everyone simply overwhelmed by the program we've been hearing?
If there are no questions, I might ask one that was already asked this morning, or rather earlier this afternoon. Is this question of humor, and this is really kind of just a general question in the round, and especially with Castoro, it struck me. And I think Bärbel and I were laughing quite a lot at some of those text pieces, So what element across those three practices in terms of the humorous sides of them would you see? If anyone can answer that.
Well, with Castoro, there's these conceptual texts about her work, like instructions for the brush stroke pieces, where she describes how, to use the broom, and then she crosses over her own words, and in order to apply the color paste, she writes licking on it, and I think it's also a very humorous turn, which is also connected, to the body language, but also the sexual.
Okay, we do have a question.
Yeah. No, thank you. Okay, yeah, I have a very simple, maybe simple question about Castoro's Land of Lads, and it's maybe a question for the people that know most about Castoro, but also maybe for David Getzi. I was just wondering because, Scott Burton was doing his behavioral tableaus, or starting to do his behavioral tableaus in the early 1970s, and there is this famous quote of him that sort of the tableaus are about the emotional nature of the inches between them, and he refers to sort of the audiences and sort of the behavioral situation in which the audience is put. And I just keep thinking of that quote when I look at Land of Lads. So the question is there any, are we aware, do we know anything about some possible references or exchanges between Castoro and Scott Burton?
Sorry.
My apologies to the panel. They knew each other through Marjorie Strider, and so they're aware of each other and all of that. But I don't think there's a strong resonance in the work. But I would just, point out that those inches between them, the precarity of those works are also, they're monoliths that may easily topple, which I would see also as a kind of behavioral or performance response to, again, some of the logics that Andre was always talking about in relationship to the vertical and the horizontal. So, but this is activated through this kind of active work that these objects have to do to stay standing. So I would say rather than that, it's coming through this idea of how to activate sculpture through movement and dance.
Yes, and she noted before. There's a quote from her about this work where she describes the leather as her cultural tool, her instrument.
Do we have one final question? It does not seem to be the case. Unless, Barbara, you have Someone
no,
else
I just was
like...
looking around and I don't want to make anyone ask more questions because it's been a long day. I think we're good at this point.
Okay, so let
probably
me...
one last answer to the contemporary, or not answer, but thought. For me, it is really interesting since I was referring back to the postmodern discourse. Since then, the contemporary was really questioned and was really redefined in the sense of contemporaneity as different contemporary moments, becoming aware of the global dimension and not only, this kind of Western-centered, perspective of the contemporary as a unified space-time. So I think this is very important for the works we were looking at, that it is really very tricky to fall back into this kind of thinking of a linear time from something that had happened in the past and right now the contemporary. So I think that is the quality of the works we have seen, that they obscure and that they complicate the question of the contemporary.
Well, thank you very much, Sabat, for that. I think that was a great comment to finish.